Hello, everyone. I'm Parthivi Das, Executive Director of C2HR, and I'm excited to welcome you to the latest installment of our HR Learning Series. Next slide, please. And we can go right to the next one. C2HR is able to offer free, quality educational programs for our members, like today's learning series, thanks to the generous support of our 2024 sponsors, including ZRG. We sincerely appreciate you. The next slide. We invite you to join us at the 2024 C2HR Con on August 5th through 6th in Brooklyn, New York. Our theme is Innovate, Engage, Belong, the Future of People. The conference is a great way to earn continuing education credits from SHRM and HRCI and gain insight into the future of work from HR experts and thought leaders. Plus, it offers a great opportunity to network with fellow members of the C2HR community. Details are available online and registration is also available at c2hr.org. The next slide, please. Today's topic focuses on the constant change we experience and how to navigate through uncertainty. This HR Learning Series will explore the mindsets of a more agile culture and why they're important during times of change. Today's speakers will share practical insights on mastering the art of agility. We would like today's webinar to be interactive, so we invite you to post questions in the Q&A throughout the discussion. These questions will be answered after the presentation. SHRM has approved the webinar for 1 CE credit, and we will send that code to you after the session is completed. Today's featured ZRG speakers are Amanda Fajak, CEO of Walking the Talk, and Bridget Ruan, Managing Director of Zuckerman. Walking the Talk and Zuckerman are both ZRG companies. Amanda and Bridget, we can't thank you enough for sharing your insight with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, welcome everyone. Bridget and I are really excited to be sharing with you our some insights and learning we have around what it takes to really build an agile culture. And what does that mean in this world of constant change that we find ourselves in? You know, as humans, our ability to change and adapt has really fueled innovation and has fueled invention over the last 150 plus years and going back into our history. You know, if you think about it, over the past 100 years, we've had TVs, we've had mobiles, we've had computers, we've had washing machines. You know, all of those things that we now take for granted have been innovations that have fundamentally changed our world. You know, if you can believe it, back in 1994, that's 20 years ago, only 6% of us had the internet. 2007, 2008 is when smartphones first came into being. I remember having my son at that stage, and there was no such thing as sitting on the couch with him as a baby and scrolling, because we just didn't know that sort of thing existed. You know, and then you think of social media, it's really only been in our world kind of purview in our day-to-day for the last 10 years, 15 years as well. So these changes in our world, you know, have really impacted us. Think of ourselves as consumers. Think of the way that you interact with the companies that are out there in the world. You know, we want immediacy. We want to be understood. We want a really high level of service. You know, whether it's our Wi-Fi, whether it's our banking, whether it's our shopping, our expectations have changed and we want things better and faster. And, you know, with that fast changing world, it has massive implications for our organizations, you know, and it's the organizations that can adapt faster, that can deliver value for customers, who can do it without spending extra money, are the ones that are able to thrive and survive in the world today. And I particularly love this graph. I mean, I think it's a slightly scary graph, but I really like this one on the S&P. It's called the S&P's Longevity Index. And what it looks at is how long do companies, you know, really survive on the S&P index. And back, you know, in around about the 1970s, it was 30 to 35 years. And now kind of in this decade, in the last decade, it's kind of come down to about 15 to 20 years. So, you know, companies are being faced with acquisitions, they're faced with competitive demands in the marketplace, they're faced with kind of changing consumer desires, which kind of means that it's really hard for them to stay on top and stay, you know, in the mindset of of the world over the longer term. So in that context, our ability to thrive, our ability to adapt in ambiguity is key. And this translates into the day-to-day experience people have working inside organizations. I was working with a media company, a year or two ago, who was saying to me that, even, 2 years ago, they had, competitors coming into the market maybe every 12 months. And now it's every 3 months is what they're saying. So, the pace of change is, without a doubt, significant. Bridget, would you like to just reflect on anything specifically that you're observing in the media industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not surprised by that anecdote from a media client, because if we did this index applied just to media companies, I think we'd find those bars all the way over on the right, way closer to that 0 on the x-axis, because media companies, brands entering into the marketplace, we're also finding churn out very quickly because of how competitive the space is. And for media, it's meant not just choice. We have more content to choose from than ever before. We can go to different platforms like we've never been able to do before. We've got linear, streaming, on demand, et cetera, et cetera. But for media companies, the other thing that it's meant for them is that we as consumers have a lot more freedom and freedom of choice. We don't have to show up at an appointed time anymore. So media has, as an industry and within our organizations, had to grapple with onboarding new capabilities, understanding consumer behavior, and getting real comfortable with rapid iteration, which is not something that we've done historically.
Yeah, and I think it's not just media in that respect too. In our 30 years of experience of working with companies on culture all over the world, we've got sort of 4 truths that we kind of observe again and again in organizations. They feel like they're too slow. They spend more time on their internal processes than on the customer. There's a lot of wasted time, energy, and effort. And then there are silos within silos in the company.
Absolutely. And that's something that we observe historically in media. It's a very difficult adjustment for media companies to make, because historically we were organized around GM models, usually, that amounted to mini fiefdoms, right? We controlled a brand, we controlled a network, we controlled one piece. And that was the way that we operated for 35, 40 years. So changing to that more modernized, cross-functional, interdependent mindset is really difficult. It's a tough pivot to make.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're seeing, as a consequence, what is the future mindset out there in the world? And it is around becoming more agile, and that's what we really want to kind of share with you, in this kind of session is, okay, how do you need to think in this kind of ambiguous, constantly changing world that we find ourselves in? And, what we often find is when we use the word agile, people often confuse it from an IT kind of way of working, because it is a set of practices that have been adopted by IT, but in our view it's so much more. And I just really love this cartoon, which I think actually really depicts this difference between coming in and just putting in some routines and rituals, but actually to be truly agile, that it's a mindset and it's a culture and it's a way of working. And and we differentiate between what we call agile as a way of being, which is the way of thinking in an agile way, which is, it's not only what you do, it's the mindset behind it, but it's also how you structure your whole organization to be able to pivot, adapt, and respond quickly to the environment around you. And that's really different from, IT, agile methodology, which is where you have some routines, some rituals, some practices that, you can just do inside the day-to-day. And, it is those mindsets that become really important for us. And, I always like using the analogy of an athlete. And if you think of an elite athlete, there's this great blend of discipline, but then there's this ability to pivot and adapt and move quickly and easily. They train to their absolute peak, but then they're able to anticipate what's coming towards them and move and respond with whatever comes towards them. And I think that's the way, from a kind of a broader perspective, we really encourage organizations to think about agile is it's a muscle to develop and a skill to develop to survive and also to thrive in the longer term. Because certainly from our perspective, change is not going to be kind of becoming less. It's going to accelerate, and that ambiguity is going to increase even further. And I think, Bridget, in terms of the environment and media, I mean, I think we're seeing that acceleration, aren't we?
Yes, absolutely. And how to balance that with being in a creative environment and not stifling creative freedom, allowing teams, because as an industry, we thrive on that ability to create new ideas, to try new things. And the way that we're being informed, especially by consumers and especially by new capabilities from other industries like tech and product, how do we inject that into what we do on a day-to-day basis and how we make decisions effectively so that we're actually leveraging the learnings properly?
Yeah. And, we went out and talked to a whole lot of organizations who were feeling that they were doing a great job at becoming much more agile. And we talked to them about, what is it that you think you achieve if you become much more agile in your mindsets and as an organization? So there were really three things. And Bridget, I'm keen to hear your kind of thoughts on this. Adaptability, so that ability to keep up with whatever the market throws at you. So, the market has this ability to pivot on a dime. All of a sudden we've got, you've got ChatGPT. How does that change what we're going to do, how we interact, how we can deliver things, how quickly we can deliver it? Then there's this idea of delivering value to customers. So, this increasing set of expectations out in the marketplace, we all have it. I mean, if I have to wait more than a day for anything on Amazon, I think it's a, it's a disaster, and let's think about it, 10 years ago, if I could got something in a week, I'd be happy. But, expectations are continually rising. And, it is about delivering the right things sooner. And that's just, our immediacy needs we have in the current marketplace. And this idea of realizing value sooner, when things are changing constantly, you can't really afford to spend a minute more or a dollar more in order to deliver that value. So you need to be thinking about how you do it in an efficient way, because you're going to have to be pivoting to the next thing again soon. So you can't take too long and you can't spend too much. Bridget, I'm curious what you observe about these.
Yeah, it's in media, right? Like the goal is absolutely no different. We want to be agile to respond to changing customer tastes, changing consumer behaviors. We want to be data-led in that thinking. We want to have a consumer lens. But it's again, like, how do we balance doing that with still being creative and not making sure that we don't suck the oxygen out of that conversation, and allowing creative teams and creative individuals to still be able to come up with new ideas. And conversely, in media, right, like new ideas don't always test very well with consumers. So you got to balance the learnings and the data and the new capabilities that you can inject into your decision making with, well, I don't want the risk of the next big hit or the next big thing not testing well, and so we don't take a risk and we don't do it. And from a talent pipeline perspective, especially with human capital management, right? We can't, as an organization, develop a reputation in a close-knit creative community that we don't value creative spirit, that we're not free to be creative and to like brainstorm and have new ideas. So we really have to be careful about how we approach the injection of a more agile mindset, because it is the new way of working and we need to do that, but within the realities of what does it mean to do it within a media construct or within any different industry construct, right? Like, because all organizations and businesses are different. Like, for example, news. Within a news organization, this concept would be even more fraught, because a news org has to be guided by a mission-driven tenet above all else. Right? They need to, oh yes, sure, data and learnings might tell us that audiences have news fatigue around certain topics, but an editor or an editorial leader needs to provide that public service of giving us the information, the important information on the topics and updates and breaking news situations of import, almost regardless of performance in some cases. So it's a very tricky balance, but it makes it no less existential for media companies, right? Because like I said, it is the new way of working, regardless of that.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. So let's dive into the mindsets, because one of the first ones is around customer centricity. So if you think about actually, if we are going to be much more agile as an organization, if we are going to be much more responsive and adaptive to the environment, and we're going to build that as a muscle in our organizations, what does it take? And, in our view, there's like 4 key mindsets. And certainly we've talked to lots and lots of organizations. We've worked with lots of organizations on this, and this is what we see again and again. It's around customer centricity, empowerment, experimentation, and collaboration. So let's dive into customer centricity, Bridget, because I know we've had some really fascinating conversations about what this means in media. But the kind of premise behind this is that ultimately the world is moving way too fast for you to become disconnected with the customer or the marketplace, and I think that having, spoken about media, maybe the marketplace, which is a great way to think about this, so in agile companies and in agile organizations, you're really thinking about that kind of end user. What do people think? What do they do? How do you co-create with them? It's about being curious. I mean, the main thing here is about not having a mindset that you have all the answers, but I'm so conscious of that media example you've given, Bridget, around, actually we've got a duty of care to the kind of environment. So, what do you see this one meaning in terms of customer centricity? And I'm also curious about, what does this mean in times of change as well?
Yeah.
How do you see this playing out?
Absolutely. Yeah, I could talk about this for hours. So I love this topic because it's something I'm really passionate about. In media, customer focus, ironically, is a bit of a foreign concept because we used to have really great creative minds, and we still do, across our industry that told us what's good to watch, what's good to read, what's good to listen to. And now we're being far more informed. Like we said, customers have a lot of freedom. We don't have the appointment viewing anymore. We've got to compete not just with other content companies, but with other industries. So how it's flipped the script on us a little bit. There was much more of a build it, they will come model before. Like if I've got the best show, I can get people in the door. Now we really do need to inject what we're seeing from consumers. What do they like? What are they engaging with? And pulling that data way up to the front of when a decision or a thinking even starts, because otherwise it's just a retrospective, right, on like what worked, what didn't, and it doesn't really inform the work going forward. So being really comfortable, like when I see organizations who do this really well, it's that they're very comfortable having that necessary expertise all in the room at the front end of that thinking, and they're not guarded about, well, no, this is my idea. I'm nervous. I don't want to share it yet. It's not ready. Like being very open and comfortable, gathering that set of expertise on the very, very front end of when we start thinking or planning or allocating budget resources, frankly, right?
And actually, what I've observed is it's not necessarily about always erring on the side of the customer, but having that debate and having that conversation and thinking about it really consciously. And I wonder also, is it around channels as much as it is around content, particularly in media as well? Looking at the channels that customers engage with you on and how they want to engage with you becomes kind of, a new focus topic.
Absolutely. And we, as any organization, any business model, we have finite resources, both budgetarily, human capital wise, just time wise. And being able, organizations that do this well are also in media very good about making a hard decision, because in media, we are very emotion led as an industry. We're passion driven. That's why we get into it. That's why we love it. But that means that we get really connected to an idea. We get really emotionally involved. So if we're seeing that it's not working, makes it even harder to stop doing it. So getting that better at that muscle and making a hard decision and trying something new is really key.
Fantastic. And, I think, I don't know what you observe, but certainly in times of change, my experience is that this comes under pressure, doesn't it? Because the tendency is to want to look internally and to, make sure everything's working okay internally as well. So, when you are in an environment that is ambiguous, that's changing, there's mergers, there's acquisitions, there's new entrants, it is kind of a tendency to kind of
absolutely. And recognizing we don't just focus on our own consumers, our own audiences. We need to know what everybody's doing. What else are they engaging with? So you do run the risk of, well, we're looking at our customer and we're watching what our customer is doing. but not necessarily understanding, well, what's the customer or the consumer that we want to get? And that, yeah, balancing, okay, externally, not just what are other media companies doing, but what are other industries doing? Where are people spending their time and why?
Yeah, and we would say that the skill that you need to have to future-proof your business is openness and curiosity. They're the kind of underpinning kind of mindsets that really enable, a lot of these mindsets that we're seeing here. So let's go on to empowerment. The idea here is that ultimately the world is moving way too fast for all the decisions to bottleneck and run up to the top of an organization and then come back down to the people who are really having to make the decisions. So how do you kind of keep decision making kind of deeper inside the organization so you can pivot as quickly as possible when it needs to be the case? What we know with organizations that do this really well is that people do believe they're responsible to deliver for others. We do find that leaders can step away from that kind of need to control. And, what we find actually happens is that they tend to put in really good guardrails, kind of boundaries that people can operate within, but then giving them the freedom to kind of act within those boundaries. Bridget, just some reflections on that one.
Yeah, and media is in a very tumultuous time right now as an industry, as we've seen. I think the big 5 media companies, maybe with the exception of one in the past 6 months, have gone through mass actions that have impacted a lot of teams. And that is just a continuation of a pattern that we've seen over the last several years. So we're talking about orgs in an industry that are already quite anxious and already very aware of what's happening around them. So the uncertainty in terms of empowerment and getting people comfortable with making a decision without worrying, will this put me within the next round of actions that may or may not happen, which is a very real fear, right? And change in general, right? We as humans process it emotionally. We don't process it logically. So we come to it and we perceive it kind of as a threat to our job, our livelihood, our way of working, our daily habits, all of that. So we need to get people out of that emotional mindset and into a more productive one when thinking about how do we empower teams and push it down. So like you're saying, the organizations and leaders who do this really well, they, number one, set goals very effectively, set strategy very effectively. And then within that, ruthlessly prioritize against it and say, okay, here's the bodies of work that we need people to gather around. And then doing deep intentional work focused on, okay, let's teach you the best practices. Let's teach the rhythms. Let's teach the way to approach this. So that it's not just sort of communications, we're teaching you a new skill. And that helps raise people up out of a emotional mindset into more productive, solutions oriented, and with a bias toward action.
I love ruthless prioritization. I would agree with you. I think the ability to do that is definitely part of this, because it kind of helps people get focused and know what's expected of them. Because part of what happens in change is that there's so much going on and people get confused, and so it makes them kind of close down and do nothing. So the kind of clearer that you can be on what is it specifically that you want me to do, the more you're going to get people continuing to kind of contribute and drive outcomes.
And understanding that this is not just project-based. This is not just initiative-based. This is not a one moment in time. We are fundamentally approaching the way that we work differently. And so if we can get mindsets shifted around that, then you make it sustainable, right?
Absolutely. So let's jump into experimentation, which is often the most controversial in the Agile mindset, because really the idea here is that, in today's world, we can't wait for something to be perfect. And we can't hold on to ideas that are no longer working, because actually we need to, this word fail fast, you hear it a lot around Agile. We need to let go quickly, if customers or the market is telling us to do something different. And, this is where, I talked about openness and curiosity. Again, organizations that do this really well are really open to feedback. They're really open to learning, they test and they experiment, around what could be different. And, talking to a few organizations who I think do this really well, they've kind of shifted from this idea of right and wrong to learning, always asking, I wonder what this could produce. I wonder, let's give it a try and see if it works, and that kind of approach. Bridget, how does that sort of fit in the media world?
Yeah, exactly. It's still quite foreign for us because we've been organized around GMs. There was a lot of clarity in that structure. Success in my job meant a very observable thing, right? Like leadership is going to give tasks. Success for me is if I accomplish those tasks. That's a very clear check the box way of approaching daily work and measuring performance, right? And in these models with experimentation, you're not being given that task. You're being asked, right? You're being empowered, as we were talking about, to come up with it on your own and to see if it works and to iterate on it when it doesn't. So that mindset is fundamentally completely different from the hierarchical decision-making model that we had prior. It was very leader-led. So that fear of failure now is antithetical to a spirit of experimentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having leadership model that behavior, having leadership continually communicate against it, having resources available, it's essential. And to understand that pattern recognition and being like, oh, we need to get in front of it and help teams along in this journey and explain what it is we're asking them to do.
Yeah, and I think, what's really interesting with this one is I think this becomes particularly hard to do when you're in change, because if I worry my job is at risk, if I'm worried about looking good, if only a few people are going to remain, or there's a merger and somebody's going to be deciding who stays on, the risk is that I try and play it extra safe. And so the kind of tension here, or the dilemma, is at a time where actually we need to be more experimental and we need to kind of test things more. The tendency is to kind of play it extra safe.
Yes, and in any industry, I think particularly in media, we've always had third rails that we don't risk against trying something new. For example, oh no, we couldn't. You'd hear all the time like, oh, we can't do that. Ratings will drop. Oh, we can't do that. Distributors or our affiliate relationships would, it would mean a tough conversation. But we need to deeply tell teams we're not afraid of that anymore. That's not how we measure success. That's not, we need to try something new because behaviors are changing and the business model's changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Which does bring us on to the last one, collaboration. Whilst we kind of go through this, please, if you've got any questions, please pop them into the Q&A for us. We've got a good 10-15 minutes at the back end of this to answer any questions that are coming to mind as Bridget and I are talking. So let's talk about teams, because certainly, the thing that always amazes me is how long have we been working on teams and teamwork and high-performing teams. I'm pretty sure in my entire 30-year career, I started doing work in teams and facilitating better collaboration in teams. And yet still, here we are in 2024, and it is one of the kind of things that is the hardest to kind of achieve. We get great in-team collaboration, but how do we kind of get that connectivity and connection across organizations? And so, certainly though, that from an agile perspective, the reason this becomes important is that the world's becoming more complex. The problems that we need to solve can't be solved by one person or one team on their own. And not only that, customers, when they interact with organizations, they want to have a seamless experience. They don't want to have a different experience when they're interacting on one channel or with one product that's very different from another. So, organizations that do kind of better at this are much better at unlocking that potential of people across teams. And, the teams are much more self-driven, they're much more dynamic, and they tend to kind of form around specific projects, around specific objectives, and then kind of move away. So rather than having these static kind of silos and static business areas that people belong to, there's much more of a sense of actually we're here to come and solve a specific problem together.
Absolutely, 100%. Like we used to mean collaboration in the sense of partner deeply within your function or within your own team around a problem, come up with your solution for it, and then present it to stakeholders, right? A very kind of show and share type of model. And now we mean collaboration much differently. We mean we want those experts around the front end of that conversation at the beginning in order to solve that problem. We don't want you to come up with your solution and the other function to come up with theirs, and then we knit them together. We want you to come up with a shared vision of how do we solve this problem that we've identified.
Yeah, and and again, coming back to change, it's that same challenge that we've talked about for the other behaviors, is this idea that actually during change, we tend to kind of focus in on what we can control. We focus in on who we know best. And the danger is it kind of exacerbates people kind of pulling into their smaller team rather than looking out and across the organizations. The actual kind of environment of ambiguity can kind of work against this particular.
Yeah. And again, like leaders and teams and especially in human capital management or people experience, recognizing or knowing that pattern recognition will happen and getting in front of it, I think is key to changing that behavior.
Right. Great. So hopefully this has given you a great insight into the mindsets for an agile culture. I mean, I think what is hopefully evident from the conversation that Bridget and I have shared with you is these 4 mindsets are interconnected. They don't really work in isolation. It's about how the 4 work together. Those kind of behaviors of openness, listening, being curious are really important in terms of all of these. It's also, the reality is these could come under pressure during change. So the irony is, as they become most important, they become most difficult to do. So they require you to be more focused, more intentional than you think you need to be in order to kind of bring them into your organizations. And, ultimately, the world we're facing has massive changes that it's going through. Our organizations have got massive changes, and this really has implications of how we work. And Bridget, I'll hand over to you for any closing points.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I would just underscore that it is so important, as you said, Amanda, like intentional work around this, because we can't just communicate about it. We can't just send memos. We can't just say, this is an announcement. As we said at the top, that's just doing Agile. Organizations are like bodies. We're made up of people that have daily habits that get work done. So change, like you're saying, is like surgery. We cut through a lot of that connective tissue. We break apart a lot of those memories about how to work something or solve a problem. So Agile cultures and deep cultural work is like the physical therapy that the body needs to remember how to walk and eat a steak again. It's how we make change sustainable, to go from just doing it, making announcements about structure or roles or whatever, to being agile and responding to change as needed.
Yeah, great, thank you. So now it's time to kind of hand over to you, and if you want to kind of ask some questions, we'll kind of spend some time looking at those now.
Yeah, Amanda and Bridget, that was a fabulous discussion. Thank you so much. We are getting a few questions in the chat, but I would definitely encourage everyone to continue adding questions. The first one is great. How do you maintain a culture when you actually don't know what your company culture is?
That's an excellent question, Kimberly. I mean, at the end of the day, those kind of mindsets and behaviors around openness, curiosity, learning, I would say that in the future world of work, that is the capability that you want to build inside your organization. And, our view is you need to be revisiting your culture as your strategy evolves. So it isn't a static thing, but it's actually something that you're continually reviewing as you review your strategy. So, potentially, every 18 months you're looking at, actually, are we fit for purpose? Is our culture kind of enabling us to kind of achieve outcomes? Bridget?
Yeah, I really love this question, especially for media, because I think that we often conflate a little bit our culture to our brand identity, our consumer brand. So we are Disney, we are HBO, and then suddenly working at HBO is really working at Warner Brothers, and it feels like a loss of identity in media. But when we say culture, we're really talking about what does it mean to work here? And what it means to work here is how we interact with the people, which is really the behaviors that we want to see. So if we change culture and our understanding of it to really the behaviors around what we need from teams, then we can create one that sustains and goes beyond and is a constant in the face of a rebranding or a merger.
Yeah, sort of along those lines, another question came up that says, can you provide an example of where you have helped a company build and maintain an agile culture?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly worked with a number of organizations. I mean, one in particular comes to mind because I think it's kind of in the gaming industry, it's technology, that fast moving, loads of competitors, lots of mergers and acquisitions. And, you know, the kind of key things that were really critical in terms of building that culture for this particular organization was around, you know, holding the mirror up around how agile are we? Because in fact, when we started conversations, organizations, oh, you know, we're so used to change. We've been changing so much. We're really adaptable. But when we kind of went down and dug down into the mindsets, what they realized is that they didn't ever listen to their customer. And actually they had a deep desire for perfection in particular. And so, you know, the work with that particular organization was getting them to engage in experiments. And kind of we got them to actually create and craft, you know, experiments that they could just do inside the day-to-day that was small, but they were easy to kind of build the muscle of, you know, actually we could just try something, and if it fails, it's okay, and we can try something else. And in fact, what we ended up doing with that organization is we got them to equally share the successes of those experiments as the failures. So we said, actually, we want to hear about the experiments that didn't work and what did we learn from them. And in fact, when we went through that exercise, what people discovered is actually they learned way more from what didn't work than what did work. And that was really a kind of a catalyst for them kind of being able to maintain this in the future, because it started a practice. You know, Bridget was talking about the patterns and the practices, and this was a practice of actually, let's try small things and let's learn when it doesn't work, while it's safe. And that kind of became okay in this organization, and maintained over the longer term.
I love
Right.
that example.
Another question that came in is, in my organization, it is not okay to fail. How do you make it okay to fail?
Yeah, I like what Amanda just said, actually, the celebrating the mistakes, or like when something didn't work, treating that like a success, or not like it's, but treating the act of experimenting and finding out what worked as the success, I think can really help reinforce that new behavior that we want to see. I always think of, I have a 4-year-old son who plays t-ball very not well, so apologies for the analogy, but like one of the little kids will trip, or like a ball will hit them, or they miss the catch or something and get very upset. But if the crowd and the parents really cheer, it snaps them right out of it, and they get right back to it, and they do it again. And then it's just about learning and about trying. And if we celebrate the trying, then that can really help.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll go back to what I sort of said earlier. There is no right or wrong. There is just learning. And I remember talking to a company when we were building out the mindsets about Agile. And I said, what happens when you make a mistake? And they go, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, when you make a mistake, what happens? And they go, I don't understand you. We don't make mistakes. We just have learning. And so that became, it was a big insight for me, actually, because I hadn't thought of it that way. I've got a couple of great examples of organizations. There's one company that we've worked with, and they actually have failure parties. So they once a month, they have this big party, everyone comes together, they get drinks, and they celebrate something that didn't work. And it's a real kind of celebration. And, you know, that it's a routine they've built in, and the leaders started this, and they started really sharing it. And it's got such a great momentum inside the organization now that it's something that they do on a monthly basis. The other thing I would say is, you know, I remember working with a telecommunications company, and they were trying to bring Agile in. And I always remember the leader of that group. She was incredibly visionary. She was a really strong leader. And she said, look, they had to roll out this product across the business in 10 different rollouts. And they had done the first one. She said, let's take a learning about what happened and what worked and what didn't work. And they ended up finding in this retrospective, so they did it as a retrospective, a major issue. that hadn't worked in this one, and they realized that it could have actually replicated itself in every single one of the subsequent product rollouts across the organization. And if it would have happened in a larger part of the business, it would have literally cost them hundreds of millions and massive reputational damage. And so they ended up telling this story about this failure and the fact that they'd done this retrospective, they'd caught this issue, and it had saved the organization. So owning up to failure and learning became, really quite quickly in this organization, something that people embraced and encouraged. So, I think you can do things like that where you find the examples where it makes you better. And I'd encourage you to do that.
Looks like we have one final question in the chat, but if there are any additional questions out there, please feel free to type them in. The last question is, how do you manage risks if you have an agile culture?
That's a great question. I mean, especially after, talking about failure risks, I think I would say two things. First, the strategy, being very clear, being very consistent about what is our ultimate goal. And when we are able to do that and set that target, we can ensure that those empowered teams and the bodies of work that we're resourcing, prioritizing, that we're focusing on, that they ladder up to driving that goal forward. So we can be assured that the bodies of work that we want to elevate and resource are tied to driving us toward what our ultimate strategy is. And I think the second thing is, ironically, like Agile done well is meant to surface risks much faster and pivot away from them much quicker than in older models, right? So we should be empowering teams to come up with their strategies and their mini tactics to achieve our ultimate strategy, that then if they see that something's not working, they're pivoting away from it quite quickly.
Yeah. And I mean, I might just close by, there's a great analogy that a insurance company gave me about how they think about risk and agile. And they said it's the difference between a set of traffic lights and a roundabout. So both ultimately kind of, control, and both of them manage risk to kind of make sure you don't have an accident. One does it in a very structured, deliberate way, the red, green, orange lights. And the other has some rules, but allows people the freedom to act. And that is the difference between agile and non-agile. And so you're the roundabout rather than a set of traffic lights. Amazing. Look, thank you, everyone. I'm conscious that we're at the end of our time. If you found these insights useful, the ZRG Consulting consults on media. We consult in culture, and we consult in talent advisory. So please reach out to us if there's anything more you'd like to learn about the work we do and more about Agile. And also, I believe this contributes one SHRM point to your learning. So I hope that's been a useful time for you. Thank you.
Well, we want to thank you, Amanda and Bridget, for your time today, and ZRG Partners for sharing your insights. I think I wrote down so many wonderful tidbits: ruthless prioritization, thinking about culture in terms of behavior, not the company you're working for, but how you want people to be presenting themselves. So we can't thank you enough for taking your time today to share your insights. And thank you to the C2HR community for hopping on today's HR Learning Series, and look forward to seeing you all in August at the conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.